Welcome to another episode of Talking College Football with JJ Kitchen. Of course, I'm your host, JJ Kitchen. Guys, if you've not done so, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. More and more information is going to be dropped, and we have an athletic director coming on to the show. We'll be doing an interview with them. You want to know about it from the Big Ten, by the way, drop it down below. Subscribe to the channel. More videos will be being released. And, of course, like the video. It helps with the algorithm. Of course, the show is sponsored by Colonial Beer, located at 4986 Library Road in Bethel Park, PA 15102. Great people, plenty of selection. Go in there, meet them, run by two great Pitt men. Of course, go ahead over to my friends and support Colonial Beer, located at 4986 Library Road in Bethel Park, PA 15102. But the main topic of today, a very striking interview from Iowa State athletic director on the conversation of, does the Big Ten and the SEC push people out? That's currently where we're at Iowa State athletic director Pollard had a strong statement for this. And it really got me to start thinking, because obviously the ACC and the Big 12, two conferences, obviously the ACC right now going through a number of lawsuits between Florida State and Clemson. What will end up happening with that? Eventually, I still say they end up getting out. They'll pay a buyout fee, and they'll certainly move on. But, of course, the Big 12, another institution where a conversation came up recently about Kansas potentially going to the SEC, leaving the Big 12. And, obviously, Kansas joining Missouri in the same area, joining the SEC. But the topic of today, will the SEC and the Big Ten actually push out the bottom feeders? Again, Iowa State athletic director seems to think so. And I'm going to show you guys a video here, him talking about it. I'm going to share my screen here. A very interesting, and I thought very straightforward. Usually you don't see that. Usually you don't see this from an athletic director from a Power 4 conference being this straightforward. Obviously, if I was a member of the Big Ten or SEC, I'd start looking over my shoulder and wondering, when is the day going to come when the top of the SEC is not going to want the bottom of the SEC? Pollard had a strong statement surrounding the landscape of college athletics. Those with gold make the rules. Here's what he had to say.
You just have to look at the evolution. It isn't the SEC and Big Ten. It's those that have all the gold make all the rules, right? So if I was a member of the Big Ten or the SEC, I'd start looking over my shoulder and wondering, when's the day going to come when the top of the SEC is not going to want the bottom of the SEC. I mean, go back and look at times when the AFL and the NFL merged, they only needed one commissioner. And when the ABA and the NBA merged, they only needed one commissioner. There's going to come a day they don't need two $6 million a year commissioners, and they're going to eat their own. And if we think that's not going to happen, you're a fool, because we didn't think the Pac-12 would get eaten, and it did. And, the CFP is just another example of our industry running amok, and they're trying to, swallow the ACC and the Big 12. And I wish them all the best, because they're going to eat their own.
So you think the Big Ten and SEC do not exist separately at some point? Is that what you're saying, I guess, in terms of how you phrase it with the commissioners?
I'm just saying, from an evolution standpoint, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, is the Pac-12 going to be existent in 2025? I think all of us would have said yes. So you don't have to look back very far to see what's happened, and you can see what's happening. And so it's reasonable to project into the future and say, why wouldn't you think that will just continue, that those with the gold will make the rules?
So a very stark conversation there. And one of the things that was very noticeable, and I have another video from him to talk about upgrades to the facilities. There was a new wrestling facility going up. That's no longer going on because of the constant constraints the Big 12 schools are going through currently in college realignment, but also to NIL. Iowa State struggling to get off the ground with their NIL program. But the noticeable thing just in that comment, one, it was stark. It was very straightforward. I think that's very rare to find in college football these days, in college athletics. Usually every athletic director at this point is trying to stay behind closed doors, keeping things close to the vest. Not here. And I think that when you look at it, there's been a conversation around the SEC, obviously the ACC and the Big 12, two conferences, the top heavy teams. Obviously, you have Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina. You have Miami, obviously in the ACC. The schools that are really big brands in terms of the ACC, and then obviously in the Big 12. I guess you would say the biggest brand in the Big 12 would maybe be, Kansas. Obviously, potentially a conversation being had about them going to the SEC to match up with Missouri. Does that really happen? There's still questionable things about that. So the Big 12's worried about that. But obviously the Big 12 after that, maybe Utah, but there's no massive programs in the Big 12 anymore. It's a very, I think, good universities, good teams, but nothing that really strikes you as a powerhouse where the SEC has Alabama, Georgia, even Tennessee I'd put up there. Obviously, then you have in the Big 10 right now, Michigan, Ohio State, then the addition of Oregon and Washington. Obviously, you have UCLA and USC in there with major brands, obviously struggling recently with a little bit of lackluster success, lack of overall support. Those schools, but there are teams in there, massive brands. You have to start having the conversation to where, Pollock, the first thing he says there, Pollard says, the underachieving teams are the bottom dwellers. When does the SEC and the Big Ten say that? Well, when you look at it, a number of people from an article that was recently published, the bottom feeders, the SEC, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Kentucky, South Carolina, and then they added 2 schools in here, Florida and Auburn. I still think they're very large brands, obviously, just in the football in terms of actual success. They've not done well in recent history. Obviously, Auburn, getting a national championship with Gene Chizik back in the day. But you look at the teams at the bottom dwellers, I would agree with Arkansas, Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Kentucky, and South Carolina, and even Kentucky in there. They've had success reaching that 8-win, 9-win threshold, but obviously nowhere near competing for an SEC title where that really belongs to Alabama and Georgia. And we'll continue to see what Alabama looks like under new head coach Caleb DeBoer. But right now, Kirby Smart really runs that conference in terms of what the SEC looks like. Then in the Big Ten, plenty of bottom feeders here when you think about it. They really had to. And the ESPN article says potentially Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Purdue, Northwestern, Rutgers, Maryland, and Michigan State. I mean, those are all a number of schools there that have been losing records. Obviously, the Rutgers addition to the Big Ten has not turned out to be good at all. Same thing with Maryland when they left the ACC to go to the Big Ten. They took less of a share. They're still not receiving a full share yet. Obviously, Rutgers has been atrocious in football for years. Greg Schiano saw a little bit of success here this past year. But when you look at the diagram of what their football program has looked at the past 10 years, it's been absolutely atrocious and mediocre. So when does that currently start happening? And do I think it's going to happen? Personally, me, I think he has a good point there. I think when he talks about how, the SEC and the Big Ten are trying to swallow the ACC and the Big 12, I mean, he's right. It's 100% right. And especially, too, I think really when you look at the Power Four, I think there's plenty of good teams, good football teams in each conference when you look across the board. But it's a Power 2 conference in terms of revenue right now between the SEC and the Big Ten. And obviously, there's crown jewels within the ACC, and what that potentially looks like and what that lawsuit looks like will really guide what the ACC is going to go through in terms of looking at teams that could potentially go to another conference. But I think when it comes down to that point, he's got a good solid point. There are going to be teams in those 2 conferences that you have to say to yourself, you know what? Do we drop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. You drop 14 teams out of both of those conferences together, merge the SEC and the Big Ten and create an NFL style, two conferences, the NFC or the AFC. You have 2 conferences, but really in the same division, sharing the same money, collectively billions of dollars. I wouldn't be shocked. I think when you look at the money aspect of it, it makes a lot of sense for the SEC and the Big Ten to say, you know what? If they have a Power 2, maybe you add a couple schools here and there between the ACC and the Big Ten that maybe you see a little bit of value. But when you look at those other teams that have no sense of potentially even vying for an SEC championship game or a Big Ten championship game, do you take them out and say, hey, the big schools for instance, the Big Ten, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon, Washington, it's more money for them. It's more money from them instead of getting the $100 million that they're going to potentially get here, in the next couple of years, all the way leading up to 2031. What about you drop more of those teams instead of getting $100 million, you maybe get $200 million. So the world completely changes if you really push those schools out. But on top of that, you have that along with the recent recent article just came out about the NCAA almost coming to a conclusion with their lawsuit, with the Title IX lawsuit, where each and every team in college football will have up to potentially $20 to $25 million in the cap to pay players. When you look at the numbers across the board, mentioning those teams, obviously teams in the ACC, teams in the Big 12, majority of teams in the Big 12 cannot pay that. I would say about out of the schools in the ACC, probably half of them can't pay that. The other half certainly can because of the large endowments, the major donors coming in that we currently have in the ACC. But when you look at the SEC and the Big 10, they've got plenty of donors. They got plenty of money, but more importantly, the revenue coming from TV streaming, it's all there. They'll be able to afford that. But the question will come down to these teams that are not continually vying for a playoff spot or vying for a championship game, are they really worth having in there? Excluding them and then creating a division or two conferences where it's just two conferences where you just have a ton of money, potentially, $200 or more million to each school. That could potentially come down the pipeline. Me personally, do I want to see any of that happen? No. I think the more teams you have in there, the more viewership you'll be able to attract to each one of these conferences because you have more fans involved. I think the more times you take out more fans, the more times you take out more teams, you start having that conversation. Well, it's not the National Football League. They'll never compete with the NFL because the NFL is the best of the best, where you take the top 1% of college football and put them into the National Football League. So they'll never compete with the Super Bowl or the NFL playoffs or anything like that. I think the NCAA or these conferences really need to understand that you need to keep a certain amount of teams in the conference to make sure you allow for viewership. Because obviously you'll still have great matchups if you knock some teams out from the SEC and the Big Ten. It'd be cool to have those, Bama versus Ohio State or Georgia versus Penn State. You'd have a number of those conversations going on with those larger institutions, or Georgia versus Oregon, Georgia versus Washington. You've seen some of those games here this year, but the overall attractiveness to watching games and viewership on television is really where the question comes down to. Where are people going to want to be engaged? Are people want to go watch these games? Personally, I think it would be important to keep those teams in there and not drop teams from the Big Ten or the SEC. But overall, the way this is going, it certainly goes to show that the TV networks are really controlling where and when these things are happening. Obviously, the Big Ten TV contract goes till 2031. ESPN has a discussion and potential idea where they don't want to exercise the option coming up here next year with the ACC. They drop out of that potentially. That's a whole other conversation. Then you have another whole conversation of where who sticks in the SEC, who is the SEC going to add, who's the Big Ten going to add. So there's a lot of questions going on, but I thought this was an incredible interview where the frustration you can see in that video coming through the screen, where the Iowa State athletic director certainly has a lot of stress on his mind. I would imagine a lot of Big 12 teams, obviously, they wouldn't want to lose a Kansas to the SEC. That's a big brand, especially in basketball. Their football team these past couple of years have made a bounce back to where usually you see Kansas at the bottom of the Big 12, but right now they've bounced back with good coaching. Lance Leipold has done a really good job there overall. But when you look at these conferences, dropping teams that are not doing what they're supposed to do could potentially lead to getting left out of these conferences. And again, there are numerous teams on this list that would never even sniff a conference championship. Obviously, in the Big Ten, Michigan State had a run towards the Big Ten championship game. Northwestern got into the Big Ten championship game as well, but the rest of these teams, you kind of got to think they don't have a shot. Same thing, especially with South Carolina, Auburn. They're looking to trying to find a way back. Vanderbilt would never have a shot. Mississippi State would never have a shot. So you have to wonder, do they get kicked out of that conference as well? So that's going to be something to watch, and we'll continue to update you guys on that, to what that looks like. So guys, as always, again, I appreciate you viewing the video, but more importantly, the show continues to grow. Please, if you haven't, like the video, comment below. What do you think? Do you think these teams get left out? Do you think the SEC and the Big Ten truly drop teams? Let me know your thoughts. I want to know your thoughts, but more importantly, I'll keep you guys updated. So again, like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're going at a rapid rate, and we'll be having some big interviews being dropped here. So as always and forever, to college football and the forever changing conference realignment. Will it ever end? We don't know. Until next time, guys, Be safe out there.